Welcome to the show, Bethany.
Well, thank you for having me, Scott.
I really enjoyed getting the chance to get your book and look over everything and not only learn things I didn't know, but also remember things that I hadn't thought about in a long time. And then, of course, all the beautiful images that come with your book. I mean, it really is, a celebration of the Super Bowl. I'm just curious how long it took to put all this together because it has so much to offer everybody.
Yes, well, thank you for saying all that. And it was remarkably fast, but there was a whole team of people putting it together. So,
Okay.
I was doing the writing, so any of the words you see I wrote, but in terms of procuring images and the graphic design and really just putting the whole thing together, there was a whole team of people actually based up in northern Michigan, even though I'm in North Carolina, putting it together. So really, it was less than a year from kind of the conception of the idea and getting started to the book hitting the shelves, which
Wow.
is pretty crazy.
Well, and I also have to note, too, you're talking about the other people who are involved. I have to note that the foreword is written by the late, great Dwight Clark, who, as a Cowboys fan, I had to watch his iconic catch be played over and over again.
It's pretty painful for you.
Yeah. But, we tragically lost him a few months ago to ALS, and it was that was really tough. But it had to be just an amazing thrill to have Dwight Clark's name on this book.
It really was. And it was just, of course, he wasn't sick at the time we were putting the book together, and that's the nature of ALS. The first book I wrote was actually about a college baseball coach who died of ALS, so I'm pretty familiar with the way that disease can progress. And so he was well, and healthy, and really so iconic and so associated with that play that you mentioned and Super Bowls. And so I'm grateful. It was just a nice tribute and legacy that we were able to give to him without even knowing that he was going to get sick, of course.
Yeah. And I've often thought about what an incredible event the Super Bowl really is, because even non-football fans tend to watch it or go to parties for the game. So many people set time aside for this game. And I've wondered, what it is that makes it so special. And I think it's safe to say that your book covers all aspects of really what makes it special. I mean, it's the spectacle, it's the performances, the players, the history, the commercials, the money involved, the host, city, and everything in between.
We covered the weather, we talked about gambling, we talked about dips, and I think that what's been so fun about it is just to acknowledge that this one game touches so many aspects of our culture. And people who really do not even understand the first thing about football, they still care about the Super Bowl because they want to know who's going to be playing at halftime, or they want to go to a party and eat buffalo chicken dip or whatever it is. And I actually heard someone the other day on a sports talk show saying, maybe the ratings are going to be down this year because everyone's tired of the Patriots or it's not a great matchup. And someone else said, which I agree with, this thing transcends the teams playing now.
Yeah.
The ratings really don't have anything to do with the football. And I think that's true because it's just a cultural touchstone. You're not going to miss it because you have to know what happened the next day at work. I mean,
that's right.
People are going to be talking about it, and they may be talking about the commercial or the halftime show, and the football may have been completely subpar, but even so, you don't want to be the one who doesn't know what happened and wasn't sitting there. And I think in this age of streaming services, and we've changed everything about the way we watch television.
Yeah.
But this is one of the few events that you better be on that couch for that 3-hour period. That's really rare, I think, in this day and age.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I heard that discussion take place just, a couple of days ago about how the fans, I see how you could make this aspect of the argument, that the fans were kind of hoping, let's just say for this year, for the Saints and the Chiefs to be playing because it was one team that hadn't been there in ages and another team that, hasn't been there in a little while, but they were two high-flying offenses, and it'd be fun to just see that big shootout. But they were disappointed. Not only were they disappointed that didn't work out, but then the context was, well, the NFL was pulling for Los Angeles and New England because you have the Los Angeles market and the Boston market, and that's better ratings. But your point is, it's just not that simple because everybody's going to be tuning in.
I mean, all of those markets are going to watch.
Yeah.
Omaha, Nebraska market is going to watch. Seattle market. I just don't think it matters anymore.
Yeah.
And, I live in North Carolina, and I can remember the two Super Bowls the Panthers competed in, and certainly our excitement was ramped up, but it wasn't like the people around me were like, oh, I'm going to watch the Super Bowl this year.
Yeah, right.
That's such a given. So it really, I don't think it makes a difference. It might make a difference how long people tune in. Maybe they just make it through halftime or whatever, mostly watch the commercials, but the fact is their TVs are going to be tuned in.
Yeah, and we were talking about just how, everybody plans parties. One of the other things I love about the book is just these random factoids that get infused into it, but they fit so perfectly with the context, including 1.2 billion bottles of beer are consumed on Super Bowl Sunday. And then on top of that, later on in the book, it's pointed out that 1.5 million Americans will call in sick on Monday.
I love that. I love that so much. And I really think, there's been talk about making the Monday after the Super Bowl a national holiday, and nothing would be more American than that, by the way.
Right.
But it's so funny because our son, I have a son who just turned 18, but when he was like 10, 11, 12, 13, I'm not kidding, I finally caught on, but he called from school wanting to come home 3 or 4 Mondays after the Super Bowl in a row.
Yeah.
And I finally figured out that he was staying up late and eating really rich food that was just making him feel terrible the next day. And so, in my household, it was happening, and it was like, wait a minute, you did this last year. You didn't go to school. And then
you're seeing a pattern form.
So, yeah, it affects everybody. It's weird dynamic, but I again, uniquely American. And all the excess of it in terms of, all the crazy amounts of guacamole that are consumed and chips and beer and, it's all so very American. I actually, shortly after the book came out in 2015, I did an interview with the BBC host, and it was a blast because he really did not understand why we make such a fuss over this. What he did is he came to the States and he spent some time trying to kind of navigate and explain and interpret the Super Bowl phenomenon to a British audience. And so it was a completely different way of looking at it when you think about somebody from across the pond who's like, what?
Yeah, especially considering
and it's not
football.
The World Cup, because that's not one event. There just isn't anything really analogous. I mean, even the NBA Finals is 7 games. And, the World Series is up to 7 games, and then you get this one huge blast event, and there's nothing else like it.
Yeah, well, especially considering across the pond, if you say football, they're
exactly.
Like you said, World Cup, they're thinking about, or the FA Cup, they're talking about soccer. That's football to them.
We're bringing a little bit of professional football to American style football over there now.
Yes.
1 game a year, I think. And
yeah.
So that's something. But yeah, the Panthers are going to get to go over there next year. We just found out that there's some excitement surrounding that. But I don't know. I'm sure they're scratching their head and trying to figure it out.
I mean, you could make a pretty decent series of podcasts covering the aspects of the Super Bowl that you cover, especially in the section, obviously, that covers all the decades, from the 70s on. What are some of the things that stand out to you the most as you look at the evolution of the Super Bowl from the early days of just being a championship game to the big spectacle it is now?
Well, one of the things, I'm a sports writer, and that's my background.
Yeah.
I really enjoy looking into the trends and historic, trends and growth of sports. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that you see, I think, when you trace the Super Bowls through the years, is you see a change in the game. And, early in kind of the Vince Lombardi Packers days and those very early Super Bowls, it's really kind of a smash-mouth defense and a running back-centered attack. And then you get into the Joe Montana years, and the style of offense changed. You really had a West Coast offense that dominated and an air attack. And so I love that. I mean, I think in the midst of that, you had the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Steel Curtain. And there's just some trends in the game and the way it's played and what's emphasized in terms of offense. And I almost think we're swinging back towards some more of a running game just in the last few years, at least an emphasis on trying to regain that. But you do see the way that the game changes. And so I enjoy that kind of thing. You can really, even just looking at halftime headliners, we have a chart at the back of the book, I'm looking at it right now, and that cracks me up on a cultural standpoint of how much that changed. Early in the day, you had a lot of Up With People and a lot of marching bands, Carol chanting, and it was just kind of a not at all what it is now.
Yeah.
And then the pivot point for that, everybody agrees, it was 1993 with Michael Jackson and that very iconic performance. And from that point on, it was, who's the biggest superstar, what's the biggest spectacle that we can create, and the amount of money spent and time spent and attention given to it just, multiplied in crazy ways. So it's interesting to look, what was the point where that changed, or what was the point where the commercials became a big deal and started to cost $5 million. All that did evolve.
Yeah, it even seems like the approach to that halftime performance has changed too. I've noticed in the last 3 or 4 years, I mean, it's kind of gone, and this isn't to discredit the people that have been on the Super Bowl shows or halftime shows, but instead of it being necessarily who's the biggest person we can get, there's also been an element where it's like, how can we get a younger audience that perhaps isn't engaged in the game to at least maybe tune in for this? Because, you look at the bands they're bringing in even this week, and you can tell that sometimes, the choices have now evolved into certain target audiences that may not watch the game or may not be as invested in it, and maybe this will give them a reason to watch.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We did have for a little while, I'm looking, and I guess you could probably say it was 2005 to 2010, kind of the geriatric years. When we had Paul McCartney and the Rolling Stones and the Who and Tom Petty and Bruce Springsteen, and that some of those aging rockers that you kind of wondered if they were going to wheel them out there, and there's some good performances in there, but you're right. In recent years, that has not been the case, and Maroon 5 and Coldplay and some others in recent years where it's really trying to make sure that the younger Netflix generation that doesn't. They're not accustomed to stopping everything for one event necessarily. Yeah. Unless they're huge sports fans, and so you want to get their attention and make sure that they tune in.
Yeah, and I love this section about the best and memorable players that have made Super Bowl history. Your Bart Starrs, your Franco Harris, Joe Green, Jerry Rice, Troy Aikman, obviously Tom Brady. But I also like the fact that you covered some of the great football players that never won one. And, I automatically always think, I kind of default to Dan Marino when I think about that. But it was, there are some other names here that you've got that I didn't realize or, that are just equally surprising, like Dick Butkus, Eric Dickerson, and even Junior Seau. It's terrible that the
Tony
guys...
Gonzalez. Gonzalez, that's one that, but you're like, really? Because he played for so long. Yeah. Teams that never made it, too. There's teams that never have even made a Super Bowl, and then those who haven't won one. So kind of two different categories there. Yeah. But as I mentioned earlier, I was putting this book together with a bunch of Michiganders, and, they're long-suffering Detroit Lions fans. And so when you look at the fact that the Lions and the Browns, the Lions are the oldest team. They were founded in 1934, of course, the Super Bowl. Yep. Didn't exist way back then, but the oldest team to have never made it, and then the Cleveland Browns, who have had two different, manifestations also. And then you have the newer team, Texans and the Jaguars, that are still waiting. And I grew up in Houston, so I'm an anti-Cowboys fan and do follow the Texans fairly closely, so that's something I'll be waiting for.
Well, that's interesting because I've never considered Houston a rival. I know some people in Houston may, but that might just be because, the Cowboys are the Cowboys, but... In fact, I used to love watching the Oilers play. I was a huge fan of Warren Moon and Drew Hill and all those guys. And
leaving in the middle of the night and how tragic that was. So
yes.
Not really pertinent to the Super Bowl because they didn't make it either.
You were bringing up Detroit, and I couldn't help but think, too, about, one of the players obviously on your list of people that didn't get a chance to win one was Barry Sanders, who, still to this day, it floors me how much more he could have done had he just stayed in the game a little longer. He just didn't want to.
Yeah, so Barry Sanders is, I think, the quintessential example of that player who retired, before, and you're always going to wonder what he could have done. But, what we know about the physical consequences of a long football career, in many cases, you can't blame him at all. And whatever factors went into a decision like that, he knew what he was doing, I think. But it does make you wonder, and I'm sure Lions fans wonder more than anybody else.
Well, the first Super Bowl I remember watching was Super Bowl 21 between the Giants and the Broncos. And the infamous Disney ad that we're used to seeing after every Super Bowl where someone says, "You just won the Super Bowl. What are you going to do now?"
That's right.
It's funny to think that that's where it all started, was Phil Simms being asked, "What are you going to do now?" And then Disney jumped on that from that point on.
Absolutely. Well, like Disney will do.
That's right.
Prime marketing. So yeah, there was definitely a lot. There were a lot of blowouts during those years that you're talking about when you started watching it. Not very many close games. And then, I'm looking at 25, and that was the 2019 Giants over Bills result. speaking of the Bills, and you get into the long-suffering, that was the first of the four.
Yes.
The Four Falls of Buffalo, one of my favorite 30 for 30s.
Yes.
About the long-suffering Buffalo Bills. And actually, one of my favorite articles that I wrote, I think of them as articles because there were so many short things that I wrote for this book, was about losing a Super Bowl and kind of the profound loss that is, and how there are some coaches that say they would much rather not make it at all than lose it.
Yeah.
And again, like I said earlier, it doesn't really have anything comparable in sports, because if you play for the NBA Finals, at least you can say, well, we won 3 out of the 7, or we gave it a good run, and we had these opportunities. But this is such a one-and-done opportunity. And if something's not going your way, or, a player gets injured or whatever, and it's so painful for those coaches. And they never, I've interviewed some team executives and others, Ernie Accorsi, who was the GM for the Giants, and he worked for several other teams over the years too, the Colts, and he said, if you lost one and then some number of years later your team won it, it was like you just got the monkey off your back. You almost didn't even celebrate. It just evened it out. But you never really got rid of that feeling of losing one. And one of the people I read in his book was Marv Levy, and he was just so poetic. I mean, he studied Shakespeare, and he was this gentleman and a scholar anyway, that he talked about lying awake at night, and unable to sleep, and his wife crying, and just what it was like to lose. And he had that experience 4 times in a row.
Yeah.
I've never even been to upstate New York, but I really would love to see Buffalo be able to right that wrong and rectify that situation at some point.
No kidding. It's almost like you'd be hard-pressed to figure out what was the worst to deal with as a fan, the long time that the Cubs waited for to win a World Series here of late, or something like that where you've been. I know for me, I think about here even in Dallas-Fort Worth area, it still kills us to this day that the Texas Rangers actually went to the World Series and were 1 pitch away from winning it and didn't win it. So I can only imagine what that's like. Yeah.
Yeah, it really does. That is difficult. Yeah, so that was one I really enjoyed. And I also very much enjoyed getting the chance to interview the fans that have been to every Super Bowl. They're called the Never Miss a Super Bowl Club. And
yep.
Guys, and they've been featured on a Visa commercial some number of years ago, and that's just so fascinating because their perspective of what it was like to go in the late 60s and what they paid for tickets and what the experience was like versus now, and the circus of it all, and they get special treatment as they should now.
Yes.
Of kind of making sure that they are able to go and get tickets and all that, but that was fun. So there are just some human interest elements to this game, and the people that have kind of helped create the spectacle that it is and who have been there to watch it for all those decades. It's been really fun to track that.
Yeah, and in the earlier decades, the NFL would focus on picking the stadiums and cities, as you point out in the book, that offered like warm climates and made good vacation destinations, your Los Angeles, your New Orleans, your Miamis. But then the voting process changed and things got a little more complex, and it's very different now.
Yes, and you get Minneapolis last year in the freezing cold.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. My daughter lives in Minneapolis. She, first of all, was complaining about the crowds and the traffic. It was crazy up there. But I got tickled just because I talk to her all the time. So I'm used to her telling me these temperatures and eyelashes freezing and that kind of thing. But just to have the national sports media, trying to comprehend what in the world they were doing up there.
Yeah.
But then you have, crazy weather in Dallas one year.
That's right.
And Atlanta, and you have blackouts in New Orleans. And so, there have been things that have happened that are either natural disasters or mishaps with electricity and other things that have nothing to do with weather. Some of the things that Super Bowls have become known for don't have anything to do with the football. And often there are things that the organizers wish had never occurred.
Yeah, and obviously another big factor is the impact it has on that host city, and I really like how that's broken down in the book, at least the economics of it all, and show some interesting history about it, because one of the things that's highlighted in the book is the Super Bowl in Indianapolis, 46, and how you pointed out that they estimated they were hoping to generate about $324 million, and it didn't reach that. It only made only $278 million. But what I thought was really interesting was that 116,000 people came to that city for the Super Bowl, but only 68,500 actually attended the game.
Oh, yeah. That is crazy.
Yeah.
But I think that happens all the time because they just want to be near it. They want to rub up against it, but the tickets are so hard to come by when you consider how many sponsors have to get huge blocks of tickets. And I mean, there are very few tickets remaining for just a regular everyday fan.
Yeah.
And, I have a great friend whose husband grew up in Kansas City, and he went from North Carolina to Kansas City last weekend for the game.
Yeah.
And I had asked her, I said, if they make it, because we don't live all that far from Atlanta. It's about a 7-hour drive.
Yeah.
And she had said, if they make it, we're going no matter what. I'm sure we won't be able to get a ticket, but they just wanted to be in the streets around the Georgia Dome, just kind of experience it. So I think there's a lot of that, and wanting to just see the fans or go find the nearest sports bar and be there, especially if your team wins.
Yeah, and we mentioned New Orleans being a top destination, especially in those early years, and we've talked about parties. And one of the other kind of interesting and maybe not so positive things the book goes through are some of the players that made headlines about partying on the Super Bowl weekend.
That's my favorite. We call that players behaving badly.
There you go.
That's another one of my favorite features. There was some crazy stuff. Oh my goodness, now I'm going to forget his name. I was listening the other day to Dan Patrick, and he was talking about the player who had disappeared right before the Super Bowl. A few years ago, I'm going to find it because now I was flipping through. But, there are all kinds of things that some of it was misbehavior, some of it was just troubled players who they didn't know where they were when game time arose. And it just was so fun. It was so interesting to look back. And I think because the world spotlight is on that game, and so if you decide to make a really bad choice that weekend, no one's ever going to forget it.
That's right. Yeah, and the thing too is when the players or coaches look back on it, sometimes people could go party, show up at the game, and there's just kind of a wild story about the partying. But then you take someone like Stanley Wilson, for the Bengals before Super Bowl 23 and what happened with him. And Sam Weiss looked back on that, not being able to have him in the game, he thinks might have actually impacted a very close game between them and the 49ers that year.
Yeah, I think there have been several cases like that where it's been, this was a difference maker player, or it could be their performance on the field or the distraction over what occurred.
Yeah.
Like with Eugene Robinson, and that was 33,
yep.
was arrested, the night before the Super Bowl, and the players and coaches were up half the night, and Robinson did play, and the Falcons lost. And you don't know; you're never going to know what kind of impact that could have had. But it's certainly, the whole team is affected when something like that happens. I really enjoyed one of the early Super Bowl stories. Well, it was Super Bowl I, and there was a Packers wide receiver named Max McGee who didn't think he was going to play.
Yeah,
he normally didn't play very much, and so he stayed out all night in Beverly Hills, and then the leading receiver went down, and he had to go in, but he caught 7 passes for 138 yards and 2 touchdowns. So his story is evidence that maybe a wild night in this league is going to help you in some strange way. So I guess we can't always know.
It makes me think of those stories that come out after players have retired, and they'll say things like, yeah, when I was a pitcher, when I was a dominant pitcher in Major League Baseball, I did this drug or drank this, before every game. It's like, well, that puts a whole nother spin on the performance, doesn't it?
It really does. It's just amazing. It really has. So I love those inside stories. One of my favorite days of research I did for this book was watching all the commercials that I could possibly find on YouTube.
Yeah.
And coming up with these top Super Bowl commercials from each year. And it's interesting to look through those and to see the different brands. It's a lot of Budweiser.
A lot of Budweiser and Pepsi.
Budweiser, Pepsi, and Doritos.
Yeah.
In the past 20 years have done, well, really, even going back further than that. There aren't very many brand names. It's just a handful that have really made this their bread and butter, not just to have a Super Bowl ad and to pay more than $5 million for 30 seconds, but also to make them memorable. And, you have Clydesdales and a lot of dogs and animals. Doritos Crash the Super Bowl thing has been kind of a new phenomenon.
Yes.
Kind of letting every man submit commercials. And it was a lot of fun just to look back and to see how those have evolved. And, there's some that were emotional and pulled at the heartstrings, but mostly it seems like it's kind of the humor.
Yes.
That people remember.
Yeah, and I don't know what this says about me, but I know Budweiser, you have obviously the images of the dogs and the Clydesdales, like you said, but I used to like the Bud Bowl.
Well, are you more a Bud Bowl or a Puppy Bowl guy?
I do. I like the Puppy Bowl. It gets a little repetitive for me. It's like they're still just kind of running around, whereas I just love the creativity in the Bud Bowl.
That's true. That was pretty amazing when you look back on it.
Yeah, for its time, yeah.
Yeah, I was just looking in the book. I loved, we looked at the companies that were made or broken by the Super Bowl, and there was this classic Apple ad that was based on the book 1984.
Yes, I remember that.
To say that now seems crazy. It was not that good, but it was weird, and it was memorable.
Yeah.
And that really kind of it marked the emergence of Apple. And they were introducing the Macintosh, and so to look back on the Super Bowl as being the pivot point for them. And then you have companies like this Just for Feet shoe company that had a really distasteful ad that was somewhat racist, and pretty much fully agreed that Super Bowl ad killed that company on the spot.
Yeah.
And, that never even existed after that commercial.
Yeah.
You have some in Monster.com and GoDaddy that got a huge boost, but no one really knew what they were until that one well-placed, well-designed ad kind of brought them to the forefront.
Yeah, it's funny how advertising can go any number of ways, even if somebody thinks the commercial is stupid or weird. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was taking advertising in college, the instructor came in one day and said, "Everybody tell me what are the stupidest commercials that are on TV right now." And then everybody yelled stuff out. But what everybody was able to say when they yelled it out was the brand. "Oh, it's that stupid such and such commercial." And she just made a list, and she goes, "Okay, well, you see the point? You all are talking about how stupid it is, but you remember whose brand it was." And although, sometimes you can almost make it too weird where you forget who the brand was for. Like, I think it was the Super Bowl last year that decided, okay, let's be really weird, and let's take the three things that research has shown always entertains people and merge it into one, which is dogs, monkeys, and children, or babies, and we'll make Monkey Puppy Baby.
No, that was terrible. I can't believe you just made me remember that again.
Yeah, but I don't remember the name of the brand other than it was an energy drink or something, because they said Monkey Puppy Baby so many times. That's what you remember, but you don't remember anything else.
That's right. That was a fail. That was not a water cooler conversation the next day. But I feel like no matter what, there's always something that you are talking about, and it's memorable that each year.
Yeah, and obviously the other aspect of the broadcast is the network and the team that gets to cover the game, which you also break down in the book, and talking about the rotation of where it goes every year, and then how the networks are having to spend like $1 billion to get the rights to do it when it's their turn. And that's always kind of an opinion part too, I think, for the audience, because I know for me, we were talking about Phil Simms a second ago. I loved watching Phil Simms as a player. I wasn't a real big fan of him as a broadcaster. And so when CBS would get the Super Bowl, I'd be like, dang, okay. But I have to say that this year, I think CBS gets it this year, right? And it's going to be Jim Nantz and Tony Romo, and I'm kind of actually looking forward to that this year.
Tony Romo is such a phenomenon right now.
Yeah.
The best part of the day after the AFC and NFC title games to me was just rewatching his calls. He's a clairvoyant. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And I don't know how he does it, and I think that's going to be fun. He's the one that people want to see.
Yep.
And Jim Nantz works perfectly with him.
He does.
I just think they're a great tandem.
They are.
I can't wait to watch that.
Very good tandem.
People that are coming to our party can be quiet enough that we can hear the call.
Right. One of the things I think about when it comes to football is like the trailblazing impact of somebody like Leslie Visser, who was a female reporter in the NFL at a groundbreaking time, and I believe she's the first and only woman, I believe, to be inducted in the NFL Hall of Fame.
I believe so.
And now you see a lot more women involved in sports reporting and broadcasting, especially in the NFL. How do you feel about the evolution of women in NFL media over the last few years?
Well, I love it, and I'm a sports writer who covered the NFL. I covered the Panthers in 1995 and 96.
Yeah.
So when I covered the Panthers, there were very few. I mean, it was kind of an era where, in terms of sports writing, there was one female sports writer per newsroom, but God forbid we have two. Like, we just couldn't do that kind of thing. So thankfully, that has changed, and there are newspaper staffs are shrinking down to nothing, but other media outlets are recognizing that you don't have to just have one woman. You can have multiple women. Doris Burke is one that I just adore. And Holly Rowe, both more on the basketball side of things. I cannot remember her name, but the MLB, she's done play-by-play for MLB these past couple of seasons, and she's done a fantastic job. And so it's just been great for people to sort of acknowledge, hey, Doris Burke's one of my favorites, not one of my favorite women in a booth, but she's just incredible. And there are others like her that are kind of, I think, changing the perception. So it's great. Let's bring it on. And on some NFL coaching staff, you're starting to have some women with roles, and I've read some articles about them lately. So it is exciting, and I considered it a privilege to get to do this book because of that, just because I had been part of, the NFL, both as a reporter but also just a fan for quite a few years, since the 70s when I was watching Bum Phillips and Earl Campbell and the Oilers back in my childhood, obsessively, Love You Blue. And so just to get to trace some of that history and, the Super Bowl. I just turned 50, so the Super Bowl has been alive just a little longer than I have.
Yeah.
And it's been really fun to be part of that and to produce a book that I always say, if you can, read our book, it's going to make you the Cliff Slavin of your Super Bowl party.
Yeah.
Everybody wants that. So there'll be a lot of factoids that you did not know you needed to know, but they're in there and just in every possible realm that where the Super Bowl touches in our culture.
That's very true. I would recommend that. We're going to have a link to a couple of places where I was able to find the book. And I agree. I mean, if you could get that and you're having a party, that'd be a great kind of like icebreaker or party starter to pull that book out and have everybody go through it and go through the stats and remember things. I mean, I think that's actually a great idea for a Super Bowl party.
All your trivia questions are embedded in there.
That's right.
So, yeah, that's fantastic. So I'm hoping for a really good game coming up.
Yeah. Have you made your pick for this week?
I would like to see the Rams win. I'm just not 100% sure that's going to happen.
Do you think it'll be a good close game?
I hope so, but I'm thinking it could be the Patriots by 10-14.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Obviously, we have this book. Do you have something else you're working on that you want people to know about, or is there a place where you want people to kind of follow what you're doing?
I do have a website, BethanyBradsher.com, and so people are welcome to check that out. I need to update a few of the projects I'm doing now.
Yep.
The current book I'm working on is kind of out of the blue, but I think a lot of people will be interested in it, especially in the college basketball world. It's a biography of Fletcher Arrett, who for 42 years was the head coach at Fork Union Military Academy, and he coached the post-grad basketball team at Fork Union. Had opportunities to be a college coach, and he never left that little town.
Oh.
He coached more than 200 Division I players and has had 7 go to the NBA from his programs. And he was just this incredible recruiting stop for all these Division I coaches because he ran such an excellent program.
Wow.
So there's some former Fork Union players that have come to me and said, we need to put this book together. And I have had a great time already. I got to talk to Fran Dunphy, the Temple coach, who came to my town to play East Carolina recently, and this is just an example. You just bring up the name. I'm writing about Fletcher Arrett, and you get these old school basketball coaches, and their eyes light up because they all have stories, and they all have such respect for him and his program. So I love that history. I mean, you probably picked up on that. So it's been a fun.
That's fascinating.
History to dive into. Yeah, so that'll come out around basketball season time.
Nice.
The next basketball season.
The next one, yes.
Going on now, exactly. in about November. That's
Got it.
Planning.
Awesome. Yeah, those. I love those. The stories that are there and significant and powerful that don't get all the press of the contemporary stuff does sometimes. So yeah, that's one of the things I love about the 30 for 30s is they give you some of that too.
Oh yes, I can watch those all day long.
I could too. Well, Bethany, thank you so much for putting this book together and being a part of it in a way that allowed us to have such a great conversation today. I've had conversations with all kinds of people, but I've not had a chance to have a fun football conversation until today. So thank you so much for your time and for the conversation about the Super Bowl today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and everyone enjoy the game and enjoy all of your dips of choice. That's my favorite part.